Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps we, ordinary people, are not the most desperate about the state of the world? That perhaps those who best understand the patterns of history, the mechanisms of power, and the tendencies of humanity are reaching the limit of their tolerance long before we are? There is a disturbing feeling growing among the most attentive observers of the human condition. 2026 will not be the end of the world, but it may very well be the year when the wise definitively lose patience with our stubborn refusal to learn from the past and act with wisdom in the face of the future. This is no longer a conspiracy theory or empty alarmism. It is the realization that there is a limit to the tolerance of those who dedicate their lives to understanding the great movements of civilization, and that this limit is being tested in ways unprecedented in human history. When we observe the trajectory of human wisdom over millennia, we discover a fascinating and disturbing pattern. In every great civilizational crisis, there have always been voices that warned of dangers, thinkers who identified fatal contradictions, scholars who mapped with frightening precision the paths that would lead to collapse or radical transformation, from Greek philosophers who predicted the decadence of city-states to ignored warnings about the conditions that would lead to the two great world wars. History is full of moments when wisdom spoke clearly, but was systematically ignored by most of the population and those in power. What makes our era particular is that for the first time in history, we have immediate and universal access to this wisdom, but our capacity to ignore it has also become more sophisticated and efficient. The 21st century brought a paradoxical democratization of knowledge combined with an equal democratization of voluntary ignorance. Never before have so many wise people had so much access to data, historical analyses, and forecasting tools, and never before have their warnings been so consistently dismissed or distorted by information systems that prioritize entertainment over education, confirmation over truth, and the immediate over the consequential. Climate scholars have been warning for decades about irreversible changes. Historians show with surgical precision how societies collapse when they ignore specific signs. Political philosophers describe exactly how democracies transform into authoritarianisms. And the most insightful technologists explain how the digital revolution can lead us to both liberation and total slavery. All these warnings are public, accessible, verifiable, and widely available. And all are routinely ignored or treated as opinions equivalent to any other in an era that confused relativism with wisdom. The patience of the wise has always been limited because their nature is to understand consequences before they manifest. It is a particular form of intellectual suffering to observe entire societies walking toward precipices that are clearly visible to those who possess adequate analytical tools. Imagine what an epidemiologist feels who spends years warning about the inevitability of a global pandemic only to be ignored until tragedy materializes and then be blamed for not having done enough. Consider the frustration of an economist who explains in detail how certain policies will lead to extreme inequality and social instability, only to see these policies implemented under popular applause. Think of the silent despair of a historian who recognizes precise patterns of polarization and radicalization that always preceded violent conflicts, but who is accused of pessimism when trying to share this knowledge with a society addicted to superficial optimism. The year 2026 emerges in this analysis not as a prophetic date, but as a symbolic milestone calculated based on the convergence of multiple trends that the most attentive observers have been tracking for decades. It is the moment when several crises that have been gestating over the last 15 years may simultaneously reach critical points. The climate crisis surpassing thresholds of irreversibility that have been clearly mapped by science, the democratic crisis reaching levels of polarization that historically precede institutional ruptures, the technological crisis reaching stages of power, concentration, and social manipulation that may make democratic resistance practically impossible, and the economic crisis achieving levels of inequality that always, in all documented history, resulted in massive social convulsions. The specific date is less important than recognizing that we are rapidly approaching a moment when multiple systemic pressures converge in ways that may make gradual and democratic changes impossible, forcing abrupt and potentially violent transformations. What distinguishes our historical moment is that, unlike past crises, where mass ignorance could be attributed to lack of access to information, we live in an era of informed ignorance and deliberate refusal of specialized knowledge. Social networks have created informational ecosystems where anyone can find information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs, however divorced from reality they may be, while commercial algorithms systematically amplify the most provocative and emotionally charged information at the expense of those more accurate and useful for collective decision-making. The result is that we live in the first civilization in history where humanity's accumulated wisdom is literally at anyone's fingertips, but where this same ease of access has created an illusion that all knowledge is equally valid and that specialization is just another form of opinion. This phenomenon has created an unprecedented situation for the wise of our era. Traditionally, they dealt with the frustration of not being able to communicate their discoveries to broad audiences due to technological or access limitations. Today, they face the paradox of being able to communicate with millions of people instantly, but discovering that this massive communication often results in greater resistance to their ideas, not greater acceptance. The clearer and more accessible their message becomes, the more it is attacked, distorted, or simply ignored by social systems that have evolved to resist information that challenges existing power structures or that demands significant behavioral changes from individuals. The technology that promised to democratize knowledge ended up also democratizing the capacity to reject knowledge. Artificial intelligence can be used both to accelerate scientific discoveries and to create convincing disinformation on an industrial scale. Digital platforms can connect people interested in learning with the world's best educators, but they can also radicalize individuals by isolating them in increasingly extreme confirmation bubbles. The same internet that allows a young person anywhere in the world to access the best universities and libraries also allows conspiracy theories to spread faster than any pandemic in human history. In this context, the patience of the wise is being tested in fundamentally new ways. This is not just the traditional frustration of having advanced ideas that take time to be accepted by society. It is about observing entire societies developing active resistance to the type of analytical thinking and long-term planning that are essential for successfully navigating through complex and interconnected challenges. It is watching the rise of political leaderships that not only ignore evidence, but build their platforms entirely on the rejection of evidence and specialized knowledge. It is seeing educational systems being deliberately weakened to produce more easily manipulated citizens instead of more critical thinkers. Here lies one of the deepest ironies of our era. We have never had such a need for wisdom to navigate challenges that are genuinely unprecedented in human history. And never has our culture been so hostile to the very idea that some people may know more than others about specific issues. We face problems like global climate change, artificial intelligence that may surpass fundamental human capacities, genetic manipulation that may alter human nature, and weapons that can literally end civilization. But we have built social systems that treat anyone's opinion on these topics as equivalent to the analysis of someone who has dedicated decades to studying them. The growing impatience of the wise manifests in subtle but significant ways. We observe a growing number of academics abandoning traditional careers in universities to try to communicate directly with the public through new platforms. We see scientists who traditionally maintained political neutrality becoming openly activist when they perceive that their technical warnings are being systematically ignored. We notice philosophers and historians writing with a sense of urgency that was uncommon in their disciplines, as if they were racing against time to communicate essential insights before it becomes too late to apply them. This impatience does not arise from intellectual arrogance, but from recognizing that certain windows of opportunity for gradual and democratic changes are closing rapidly. When climatologists say we have a decade to implement massive transformations in our energy systems or face irreversible changes on the planet, they are not being alarmist. They are communicating conclusions based on decades of rigorous research. When historians observe that patterns of political polarization in contemporary democracies follow exactly the same trajectories that preceded democratic collapses in the past, they are not being pessimistic. They're applying the tools of their discipline to identify trends that society needs to understand in order to be able to alter them. The fundamental problem is that our attention economy systematically rewards those who offer comforting simplifications over those who present necessary complexities. It is easier to gain followers by telling people their instincts are correct than by explaining why reality is more complicated than it seems. It is more profitable to confirm existing prejudices than to challenge them with evidence that may be inconvenient. It is politically more advantageous to promise simple solutions to complex problems than to explain why complex problems require sophisticated solutions that may be initially painful or inconvenient. When we reach the point where expertise is viewed with suspicion and where doing your own research is considered equivalent to years of formal training and peer review, we create conditions where humanity's collective wisdom can no longer be effectively applied to humanity's collective challenges. This is not an abstract or academic problem. It is an existential threat to the civilizational project as a whole, because complex civilizations fundamentally depend on the ability to accumulate, preserve, and apply specialized knowledge to solve problems that are beyond any individual's capacity to solve alone. The date 2026, therefore, represents less a specific prediction than a recognition that we are rapidly approaching a moment when the accumulation of neglected crises may overcome our collective capacity for democratic and gradual response. It is when the patience of those who have dedicated their lives to understanding these patterns may finally be exhausted, not necessarily because they give up trying to help, but because the windows of opportunity for solutions that preserve both freedom and stability may have closed. Here we arrive at a disturbing question that is rarely discussed openly. What if the wise of our era decide that democracy as we practice it has become incompatible with civilizational survival? What if they conclude that systems that allow scientific truths to be treated as matters of political opinion are systems that cannot adequately deal with existential threats? This is not an advocacy for authoritarianism, but a recognition that systemic pressures may force choices that no one wants to make. Historically, when societies faced existential threats, there have always been tensions between freedom and survival, between slow democratic processes and needs for quick and coordinated action. The difference in our era is that threats are simultaneously more complex, more interconnected, and more urgent than anything humanity has ever faced, while our collective decision-making systems have become less capable of processing complex information and acting based on evidence rather than emotion. The impatience of the wise may manifest in various ways. Some may withdraw completely from public debate, concluding that their energies are better invested in preparing small groups to navigate what is coming instead of trying to save a civilization that does not want to be saved. Others may radicalize in the direction of defending systemic changes so profound that they challenge fundamental assumptions about how our societies should function. Still others may dedicate themselves to creating parallel alternatives, communities and institutions that operate based on principles different from those of broader societies. None of these options is particularly attractive to those who value both knowledge and democracy, both truth and freedom. But the reality is that systems that cannot incorporate wisdom into their operations do not survive indefinitely when facing challenges that require exactly that wisdom to be overcome. This brings us to the center of our era's dilemma: how to preserve democratic values in a world where the most important decisions for humanity's future require levels of specialized knowledge that are beyond most people's reach, and where dominant communication systems are actively hostile to the faithful transmission of that knowledge. How to maintain individual freedom in contexts where some individual choices, when multiplied by millions of people, can compromise the viability of civilization as a whole? These are not merely theoretical questions, they are practical dilemmas we are facing now. When algorithms developed by a few dozen engineers can influence the beliefs of billions of people in ways that these engineers themselves do not fully understand, what kind of governance system can adequately handle that power? When climate change requires massive economic transformations that will affect all aspects of human life, but implementing these transformations voluntarily seems politically impossible in most democracies, what alternatives exist beyond authoritarian impositions or chaotic collapses? Traditional wisdom always taught that education is the answer to these dilemmas. If people understand problems better, they will make better choices. But what happens when educational systems themselves are captured by interests that benefit from maintaining ignorance? What happens when education itself becomes a political battlefield where teaching children to think critically is seen as indoctrination by groups that prefer them to learn to obey without questioning? We have reached the point where the patience of the wise is being tested not only by the difficulty of the problems we face, but by the active deterioration of the cultural and institutional tools we traditionally used to solve problems collectively. It is one thing to face a difficult challenge with functional institutions. It is something completely different to face multiple existential challenges simultaneously, while the very institutions that should help us face them are being deliberately sabotaged. Perhaps the clearest manifestation of this growing impatience is the change in tone of the writings and speeches of those who have dedicated their lives to studying human societies. There is a growing urgency, a frankness that sometimes borders on despair, a willingness to say inconvenient truths that previously would have been communicated in more diplomatic ways. When respected historians begin writing books with titles that include words like collapse and end, when climatologists abandon the cautious language of science to use terms like emergency and catastrophe, when political philosophers begin openly questioning whether democracy is compatible with long-term survival, we are witnessing something more than academic fashion changes. We are seeing evidence that those most qualified to assess our collective situation are reaching alarming conclusions. The central paradox of our era is that we have never needed collective wisdom more, and we have never had more difficulty accessing and applying it. We have the technical knowledge necessary to solve most of the problems we face. We know how to create sustainable energy systems. We know how to build more just economies. We know how to educate people to think critically. We know how to design technologies that enhance rather than diminish human capacity to make good choices. We know how to create institutions that are simultaneously democratic and effective. What seems beyond our capabilities is collectively implementing this knowledge in the face of systemic resistances that have become more powerful than the forces that traditionally promote positive change. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, When you observe the world around you, do you feel this same growing tension between what we know we need to do and what we seem collectively capable of doing? Do you recognize this particular frustration of seeing clear solutions to urgent problems, but also seeing how these solutions are systematically blocked or distorted by forces that benefit from maintaining the problems? Many of us carry this anxiety in silence, wondering if we are the ones seeing things in an excessively dramatic way, or if we are really living a historical moment unique in its complexity and urgency. If this tension resonates with your experience, share in the comments. I recognize this urgency when your perspective can help others feel less alone in this perception that something fundamental needs to change in how we make collective decisions, and that the time for these changes may be more limited than we would like to admit. The response of the wise to our current situation will not be uniform. Some will continue in the classical tradition of teaching and writing, trusting that important truths eventually find their way to practical application. Others may embrace more direct forms of activism, using their credentials and knowledge to influence politics in ways they traditionally avoided. Still others may focus on creating alternative models on a small scale, demonstrating that different ways of organizing societies are not only possible, but superior to dominant models. But there is also the most disturbing possibility that a significant portion of our era's wise may simply withdraw from the project of trying to reform or save existing societies, not out of cynicism or selfishness, but from a cold analysis that their limited energies may be better invested in other projects. This would represent a fundamental historical shift, because traditionally, the most capable intellectuals of a society dedicate at least part of their energies to improving that society. If this relationship is broken, the consequences for democratic society's capacity for self-correction and adaptation would be profound and potentially irreversible. The year 2026, in this analysis, marks less the end of the world than the end of a particular era of optimism about democratic society's capacity to adapt quickly enough to deal with challenges that require both technical expertise and global coordination. Not necessarily because these challenges are impossible to solve, but because the political and cultural obstacles to solving them may have become insurmountable within existing institutional frameworks. This does not mean we should embrace pessimism or resignation. It means we need to be honest about the magnitude of changes that may be necessary and about how little time may remain to implement them through gradual and consensual processes. It means recognizing that preserving the values we most cherish may require profound changes in the structures and processes through which we try to realize them. One of history's most important lessons is that civilizations do not die because they face problems impossible to solve. They die because they lose the capacity to apply the solutions they already possess. Our era may be approaching a definitive test of this capacity. The question is not whether we have the technical knowledge necessary to build a sustainable and prosperous future. The question is whether we have the collective wisdom necessary to use that knowledge before it is too late. The exhaustion of the wise's patience, if and when it occurs, will not be a sudden event, but a gradual process that may have already begun. It will be marked by subtle changes in the tone and focus of those whose opinion should matter most in public policy issues. It will be visible in the growing willingness of respected academics to make statements they would previously have considered improperly alarmist. It will be evident in the increase in the number of highly qualified people who choose to leave traditional institutions, to create alternatives, or simply to protect their own families and communities. And perhaps ironically, it will only be when we begin to lose access to the wisdom of those most capable of helping us navigate our current situation that broader society will begin to perceive the value of what it was rejecting. But at that point, the window of opportunity for gradual and democratic changes may have already closed, forcing choices between freedom and survival that no one should have to make. The true tragedy of our era may not be that we face unsolvable problems, but that we possess the solutions and choose not to apply them until it is too late to apply them peacefully. And the greatest irony may be that in the name of preserving our freedom to ignore inconvenient evidence, we may end up losing freedom completely. There is still time to avoid these scenarios, but that time is limited and running out rapidly. The question that remains is whether we will manage to recognize and act on this reality before those most capable of helping us do so definitively lose patience with our collective refusal to grow as a species. If you recognized yourself in these reflections on the weight of unapplied knowledge and the frustration of seeing clear solutions being systematically ignored, I invite you to be part of a community that values the search for wisdom in difficult times. By subscribing to the channel, you will join others who understand that profound questions require careful thought and that humanity's future may depend on our capacity to collectively apply the best of our knowledge to the greatest challenges of our era. Each week, we explore these essential questions together, not offering simple answers, but developing the conceptual tools necessary to think more clearly about problems that cannot be solved without rigorous thinking. We are not alone in this search for understanding in an era of deliberate confusion. Subscribe to continue this crucial journey together toward a wisdom more adequate to the extraordinary and urgent times in which we live.